The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the small, forgotten town of San Rafael. Dust swirled through the empty streets, as if the town itself was trying to escape its bleak existence. The oppressive heat made it feel as though time itself had stopped. Everything was still except for the occasional creak of a rusted sign hanging above the saloon. Then the sound of hooves broke the silence. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, a silhouette framed by the setting sun. Clint Eastwood, in his iconic role as a bounty hunter, looked as though he belonged to the desert itself, hardened, worn, and unyielding. His horse, tired from the long ride, trotted slowly as they entered the ghost town. His steely eyes scanned the surroundings, taking in every detail, yet revealing nothing of the turmoil inside. The man had no name, no allegiances, and no loyalties, just a past full of death and regret. He wasn't here for justice. He wasn't here for the reward money. Clint was here to make El Indio pay for the lives he had destroyed. This wasn't just about the bounty, it was personal. Clint's destination was clear. The town had only one sheriff, but the real power was in the hands of men like El Indio, a notorious outlaw with a reputation for cruelty and violence. And Clint knew that somewhere within this godforsaken town, El Indio was hiding, holed up like a snake in the brush. It wasn't just about the man. It was about stopping a force of chaos that had left destruction in its wake. As Clint dismounted and approached the sheriff's office, his hand instinctively hovered near his gun, a silent reminder of the countless lives he had taken in his past. The town was silent again, almost as if holding its breath. But just as Clint reached for the door, a shadow appeared. A man stepped into view, a stranger Clint hadn't seen before. His clothes were worn, and his eyes gleamed with a dangerous knowledge, as if he knew something Clint didn't. The stranger tipped his hat, a sly grin crossing his face. "You're looking for El Indio, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low and almost playful. His tone wasn't one of curiosity, but one of certainty, as though he had been waiting for Clint's arrival. Clint paused for a moment, his instincts kicking in. His hand hovered near his gun again. The stranger was an enigma, someone who could either be an ally or a foe. Clint wasn't one to trust easily, and this man's presence was unsettling. "What's it to you?" Clint growled, his voice rough from years of use. The stranger grinned wider, showing a gap where a tooth should have been. "I've got my reasons," he said, stepping closer. "But if you want to catch him, you're going to need more than just yourself." The tension in the air thickened, and Clint's hand tightened around the grip of his gun. This wasn't a simple bounty hunt anymore. Someone else had stakes in this game, and Clint knew it wouldn't be long before he'd find out whether the stranger was an ally or another threat. Clint eyed the stranger warily, the silence between them stretching out like a tightrope ready to snap. Every fiber of his being told him to trust no one, especially not someone who seemed to know too much about his plans. But the stranger's calm demeanor, his knowing smile, hinted at a deeper connection to the situation at hand. "You'll need help," the stranger said again, his voice barely a whisper now, like he was sharing a secret. "You're not the only one after El Indio. He's a beast, and you're going to need more than a gun if you want him dead." Clint narrowed his eyes, his suspicion growing. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, his hand still poised near his holster. The stranger seemed to consider the question for a moment, then gave a dry chuckle. "Trust isn't given, it's earned. But let me ask you this. How far will you go for revenge? How far are you willing to go to take down a man who's killed so many, left families torn apart, and turned this whole town into his personal playground? The words hit Clint like a punch to the gut. He had seen the aftermath of El Indio's crimes, too many innocent lives lost. His own heart had been shattered by the same kind of ruthless violence that now spread like a disease through the town. This wasn't just a job. This was a fight for redemption. The stranger's eyes locked with Clint's. "I can help you," he continued, "but you'll have to work with me. We've got a common enemy." Clint didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, weighing the risks of working with an unknown man, of trusting someone who might very well be leading him into a trap. But deep down, he knew he had little choice. El Indio had too much power, and Clint couldn't take him down alone. He needed to take a gamble. "All right," Clint finally said, his voice low and full of resolve. "But the moment I smell a rat, you're on your own." The stranger nodded, seemingly unfazed. "Fair enough. But we need to move fast. El Indio's camp is only a few miles out, and if we don't act soon, we'll lose him for good." Clint knew this was it, the beginning of something bigger than he had imagined. He had made an unlikely alliance, and the road ahead was bound to be treacherous. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. The end of El Indio's reign of terror was in sight, and Clint Eastwood wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. The ride was long, and the desert seemed endless, the sun relentlessly scorching them as they made their way toward El Indio's hideout. The two men rode side by side, but the tension between them was palpable. Clint kept his eyes straight ahead, his mind focused on the task at hand. The stranger, now revealed to be a bounty hunter named Mendez, kept glancing at Clint, trying to gauge his reactions. "You sure you know where we're going?" Clint finally broke the silence, his voice laced with suspicion. Mendez gave a nonchalant shrug. "I've been tracking El Indio for a long time. He's not as clever as he thinks he is. He's hiding in plain sight, thinking no one will dare cross him." Clint grunted, not entirely convinced. El Indio had evaded the law for years, and his cunning had made him a legend. The idea that he would simply wait for someone to come and take him down seemed almost too good to be true. But Clint had to trust that Mendez was right. This was the chance he had been waiting for. As they approached a small rocky ridge, Clint signaled for Mendez to halt. They dismounted, their horses grazing nearby. Through the brush, they could just make out a cluster of men gathered around a campfire. El Indio's gang. Clint's fingers tightened around the grip of his revolver, the familiar weight reassuring him. He'd been in situations like this before, and every instinct told him that a deadly confrontation was imminent. But this time, it was different. Mendez's words echoed in his mind. This wasn't just about the bounty. This was personal. The two men crouched low behind the rocks, watching as El Indio himself emerged from a tent, his large frame casting a long shadow under the dying light of the day. The outlaw's face was weathered, his eyes cold, a man who had long since abandoned any sense of morality. He was surrounded by his ruthless gang, all armed and ready for a fight. "We move in fast," Mendez whispered, his hand on the knife at his belt. Clint didn't reply. He was already moving, a silent predator stalking his prey. Every step was calculated, every muscle tense with anticipation. They had to act quickly. Too much time spent waiting could cost them everything. Suddenly, a shot rang out. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the still desert night, sending a shock wave of tension rippling through the camp. El Indio's men sprang into action, drawing their weapons, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. But Clint was faster. His revolver was already drawn, and before any of the outlaws could react, he had taken down two of them in a blur of motion. Mendez, too, was in action, his knife flashing in the firelight as he slashed through the chaos. The two bounty hunters moved like a well-oiled machine, silent, deadly, and precise. But Clint's focus was on one man, and one man only, El Indio. His eyes locked with the outlaws across the camp, and in that instant everything else disappeared. The world seemed to slow, the sounds of the battle fading into the background. There was only the two of them, the past and the future, locked in a moment of inevitable collision. El Indio smirked, his hand hovering over his gun. "You've come to die, old man," he taunted, his voice dripping with arrogance. Clint didn't answer. He didn't need to. His actions would speak louder than any words could. With lightning speed, he drew his revolver, the barrel flashing in the firelight. El Indio barely had time to react before Clint's bullet found its mark, sending the outlaw crashing to the ground in a heap of blood and dust. For a moment, everything was still. The rest of El Indio's gang, now leaderless, hesitated, unsure of what to do. But the damage was already done. Clint had won. Mendez stepped forward, wiping the blood from his knife. "It's over," he said simply. "He won't be hurting anyone else." Clint stood over the lifeless body of El Indio, his expression unreadable. Revenge had been served, but there was no sense of triumph in his eyes. The emptiness inside him remained, a void that no amount of bloodshed could fill. The bounty hunter turned, his face still cold, and began walking back toward his horse. "I'll leave the rest to you," he said to Mendez, his voice low. "I've got no use for the reward. I've gotten what I came for." With that, Clint mounted his horse and rode off into the desert night, his figure soon disappearing into the distance. The ghost town of San Rafael was left behind, but the echoes of the gunfight would linger long after Clint's departure. He was a man without a future, a man whose only purpose was the pursuit of justice, a pursuit that, in the end, had cost him more than he could ever repay.